Hey, what's going on? Welcome to Spooky Bricks, where I will be talking about all my creepy, spooky LEGO creations that I have made and will make in the future. So, thank you for joining me. In this video, I'm going to be talking about my build of the Ropes Mansion of Salem, Massachusetts, or as many other people probably know it, Alison's house from the first Hocus Pocus movie.
I'll probably make us drink cider, Bob for apples.
Now, this is definitely the biggest build I've ever made so far out of LEGO. I've made some larger builds in the past, but this is most definitely the biggest single building I've done so far. And because of that, I had some issues estimating or underestimating the amount of pieces that I would actually need to finish, but I'll talk about that a little more later. So with something this big, you really just can't start randomly building, then just hope it all turns out well. You need to do a fair amount of pre-planning first. So the very first thing I did was to create a template for the footprint of the building, which is what you're looking at here. So I had to take a few different things into account, like width of the windows, the width of the doors, and how much space I wanted to put in between them. And at this point, I also had to figure out the overall size and shape I wanted for the roof sloping, since that's also going to affect the size of the building, so I made a template for that too. And because these templates aren't going to be part of the actual final building, I just used whatever random colors. After I decided the size of the house, I started to lay in the first layer of plates for the base. I used mostly dark tan, but for any area that was ultimately going to be covered, I just used whatever colors I had. To give it more of an organic look, I added some curved and angled plates around the edge, and I ultimately made 3 layers of plates for the house to sit on. I figured that would be work as a nice strong foundation for the building of this size. So I'm not a big fan of using the classic LEGO base plates, and that's really for 2 main reasons. So for one, it limits the shape that you can get. With base plates, you're stuck with squares, rectangles, and 90-degree angles. And like I mentioned, I wanted more of a curved, rounded, organic shape. And 2, base plates are just too thin, especially for a build of this size. If I had built this on regular base plates, as soon as I try to pick it up, the base plates would bend, they'd warp, then bricks would start to separate and come up, and which would obviously not at all be good. The base is mostly made up of dark tan plates, but I topped it off with some olive green to indicate grass, and I think these colors work really well together. If you stand back and kind of squint your eyes, they sort of blend together and almost create like a gradient from one color to the next, and it makes for a nice effect. Then I added some olive green plant pieces and a bunch of 1x1 round plates and tiles just to give it some nice texture. Now, you can't have a fall scene without some fall leaves on the ground. And I've done a bunch of experimentation in the past on previous builds trying to mimic the look of fall leaves in LEGO, and in my experience the best way to do this is to have one main color for the leaves, then do a few accent colors that are just slightly different from the main color. So for example, here I used orange for the main leaf color, and then I added some hints of dark orange and light bright orange just to give it a little more texture. And over here I use yellow for the main color with accents of bright light yellow and bright light orange. And I also added some random brown pieces here and there to indicate the look of some more dead leaves. For the brick walkway in front, I used a combination of reddish brown and dark red 1x2 tiles. And similar to the dark tan and olive green combination on the terrain, I think these 2 colors work very well with each other. When you pair them together, the reddish brown almost reads as like a faded version of the dark red, and it works really nicely for brick texturing. The angled pattern of the bricks is created by first doing an underlaying layer of jumper plates and 1x1 tiles, then on top of that, you add some angled 1x2 plates. This isn't a technique that I came up with myself, this is something I found on Pinterest, but it creates a really cool look, I think. Moving on to the house itself, the front door is a custom sticker I made. I did experiment with doing a brick-built door at first, but I had trouble getting the specific look I wanted. So I just opted for a custom sticker that I designed in Adobe Illustrator, and then I just printed it out on some sticker paper. So the Ropes Mansion has a lot of windows, and although I spent a lot of time planning for the layout, I did still run into some issues with having enough space for all of them. For example, these two windows over here were supposed to be the same size as all the other windows on this side of the building, but when I got to building that section, I realized I just didn't have the space for them. So they ended up getting a little smaller than their real-life counterparts. The windows are pretty straightforward, but I did a lot of texturing detail with jumper plates and the 1x2 modified plates with the door rails. If you can't tell already, I love to add little details and texturing wherever I can. And speaking of texturing, let's talk about the texture around the house itself. So the real building has this sort of narrow angled siding to it, and I wanted to mimic that as close as possible. I've done some siding techniques in the past using long 1x tiles on snot bricks, but that doesn't quite work for what I needed here. That siding is too wide in comparison, and it lacks that slight angle that I wanted. So I ultimately settled on using rows of ingot pieces to get me that angled texture that I wanted. But because ingot pieces don't have any studs on top of them, I had to make the walls 2 studs thick in order to get the proper amount of connection points. I would put down a layer of 2x plates, next a row of ingots up front, and then a row of 1x plates behind the ingots. And I just repeated that pattern all the way up the walls. And overall, I think this mimics the look of the real siding pretty well. Although this technique definitely does have some drawbacks. For one, because the ingot pieces are angled on all 4 sides, when you lay them out end to end, they don't butt up against each other perfectly flat. They create little triangle holes in between all of them, and when you have a whole wall made up of ingots, you get a pattern of all these little triangle holes showing up, and admittedly, I'm not a huge fan of that, but if you just start to look at the wall from a little bit of an angle, all those little holes start to go away, and you get this really cool sort of ribbed texturing. And when the light hits the edge of those ingots just right, it looks really good. Another problem with this technique is just the large amount of ingots it takes to complete. Especially with a build of this size, I had to do 4 or 5 different orders of ingots off of Bricklink before I finally had enough to finish. I kept underestimating how many I would actually need. I think my original order was about 700 white ingots, which sounded like a big number at the time, but I quickly realized that that was not going to be nearly enough to finish it. And all said and done, it took about 2,000 white ingots to finish, which price-wise, that can definitely add up. So yet another drawback of this technique is just how slow going it can be. Building up large walls 1 row of plate at a time can be very time consuming, and especially when you have to keep going back to Bricklink to put in more orders, that then you have to wait for those orders to show up. Then on top of that, I also kept running out of 1x and 2x wide white plates. But even with all of these issues, I'm still very happy with how it turned out, and I think it creates a really interesting look. So continuing to go up, let's move on to the roof. Now, this is the first time I ever completely tiled off a roof, and I think it gives it a really nice finished look. It almost gives it like a dollhouse kind of aesthetic, but unfortunately, much like the white ingots, I completely underestimated how many 1x2 tiles it was actually going to take me to cover the entirety of the roof. I think with my first order, I got about 600 of the 1x2 dark bluish gray tiles, and that was about enough to cover half of the front of the roof. It ended up taking about 2 more orders of the 1x2 dark bluish gray tiles until I was able to finally finish all of the roof. But that's just my fault. I could have better estimated how many it was going to actually take, but I just guessed, and so that's what happens. The leaves on the roof are just attached by jumpers and 1x1 plates. For the fenced off area on top, I used hinge pieces to connect the fence to the roof and give it the proper angle it needed. Then some 1x1 snot plates and a whole bunch of long 1x white tiles to create the rails. And finally, for the chimneys, I used the reddish brown and dark red to represent the brick, same as the pathway up front. To get the brick texturing, I used a combination of the masonry bricks, 1x2 and 1x1 plates, and some rounded 1x2 plates as well. So the roof itself is not actually attached to the house. I've made builds in the past where I did have the roofs attached to the rest of the building, but in my experience that tends to be more trouble than it's worth. I find not having the roofs attached gives you much more flexibility as far as angles and positioning. The roof sections lock into place with this 2 stud wide gap here that fits right over the 2 stud wide slopes on the walls, and that prevents it from moving back and forth. And the modified 1x plates with the door rails work great for filling in any unwanted gaps between sections. And as a final finishing touch, I added some lights. The system I use to light it up is extremely basic. I just added 2 of these little disc hockey puck color changing light things, and I got them on Amazon for about $20 for a pack of 10, and they come with these little remotes so you can just pick whatever color you want. I have experimented with lighting up my Lego builds in the past with wired LED lights, but that can be kind of a pain trying to cover the wires and everything, so these things are just a very quick, easy solution. So that about covers everything. Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching, and I will be back with more spooky builds.